With us today, we have Dr. Eric Oliver, a political science professor at the University of Chicago, who's been studying conspiracy theories for over a decade. And he's the author of Enchanted America, How Intuition and Reason Divide Our Politics. Dr. Oliver, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
And one of your key findings in your research that you've mentioned is that the same forces that drive conspiracy theories intensify political polarization. Can you get a little bit into that?
Sure. So when I started doing this research, I was interested in why people believe in conspiracy theories. And I've been doing a lot of surveys asking people about whether or not they believed in certain types of conspiracy theories. And one thing that became evident was that people who believe in conspiracy theories tended to have a lot of supernatural and paranormal beliefs. They were what we would call magical thinkers. They tended to believe that there were these unseen intentional forces that made things happen. And accepting that belief over a belief that's grounded in some kind of real evidence. And so the question is, what makes people a magical thinker? And I think the reason we gravitate towards magical thinking is because that's where our intuitions lie. If you think about like children, they don't know a lot about the world, so they really rely on their intuitions. And children are terrific magical thinkers. They see monsters in closets. They think their stuffed animals talk to them. They think about cooties. And I think what we see now is when people are relying on conspiracy theories, or when they're drawn to conspiracy theories, it's really their intuitions that are talking to them. And one of the things, for example, that our intuitions do is that they anthropomorphize inanimate objects. So children, think that their stuffed animals will talk to them. Conspiracy theorists think that, like, for example, the State Department or the CIA has a singular intentionality to it. They sort of anthropomorphize these very complex kind of political institutions. Similarly, the idea that when we face uncertainty, our intuitions are scrambling to try to find some way of ordering reality for us, because our uncertainty is very uncomfortable for us. It makes us really anxious, and it doesn't feel good to feel anxious. So we want to kind of quell that anxiety. And what conspiracy theories do is provide an easy way of trying to explain the world in a way that comports with sort of our other intuitions. But also what they do is they validate or rationalize the anxiety we're feeling in the first place. So, if I'm feeling uncertain about the world and I want something that sort of, rationalizes that anxious feeling. I give an example. When my son was little, and we had this big argument about whether or not there was a monster in the closet. We were going back and forth, and I was trying to reason with him, and that wasn't getting nowhere. And finally, he said to me, well, if there's no monster in the closet, then why am I afraid? And I think this is basically the mindset that animates a lot of conspiratorial thinking, which is that I'm afraid, and therefore there must be a monster in the closet somewhere. And then, propagators of conspiracy theories use this to their advantage. That's their willing audience that's available out there. There's an audience that's looking to have an explanation for why, for example, they may feel anxious, or why they feel politically dispossessed, or why they feel like the world is falling apart, and they're kind of losing their grip.
And you've said that most people fall somewhere within the scale of what you call intuitionists and rationalists.
Yeah, I mean, sure. Everybody has reason, and everybody has their intuitions. And, we all fall prey to magical thinking at times. We all have our superstitions. We all have, things that we do for good luck. We oftentimes do that when we're feeling stressful, and we do that as a way of kind of coping with that stress. But, and hopefully we all use our reason and rationality, and we kind of look for facts too. And most of us kind of employ a kind of combination of those ways of thinking about the world. But American society is becoming increasingly divided between people who are kind of one end of the scale or the other. And so in our research, what we try to do is try to figure out ways of measuring how much people systematically rely on their intuitions when making judgments about the world. And we came up with some scales for doing this. And then based on this, you can see kind of a distribution. There are some people who we would call rationalists. They really are very tethered to reason and facts and logical deduction. And they use that as their sort of guiding principle to sort of understanding their world. And on the other end of the spectrum are people who rely very much heavily upon their intuitions. And these are people who are very drawn by symbols and metaphors and stories and myths. And they tend to also have a lot of conspiracy theories. And there's this kind of constellation of these things that go together.
And what's one of the ways you can tell, like, what's one of the questions you might use to tell whether somebody falls on one side of the spectrum or the other?
Sure. So this is what we were trying to figure out. How do you measure whether or not somebody's relying on their intuitions without talking about existing beliefs? And that was the big challenge, because we didn't want simply just people to parrot, that they believe in ghosts or UFOs or things like that. So when we were doing our research, one of the things we realized is when people rely on their intuitions, they're heavily swayed by these these kind of cognitive shortcuts called heuristics. They're the things that we oftentimes do when we try to make sense of the world. And I think intuitionists pay very strong heed to these. And some of these heuristics are, we think things that, for example, it's a contagion heuristic. We think things that have had contact with something that's bad shares that bad quality, or something, something that's good. Like, oh, if I had, this necklace and it once belonged to Marilyn Monroe, it's suddenly a great necklace, in that regard. So people tend to, that's our intuition, gives these types of objects power. We also tend to think that things that look like certain things share their qualities. So like a voodoo doll, you would think, it's what's called a representativeness heuristic. So what we want to do is to tap into people's sensitivities to these heuristics. So we put a series of questions for people. And we ask things like, would you rather stab a photograph of your family 5 times with a sharp knife, or stick your hand in a bowl of cockroaches? Or would you rather sleep in laundered pajamas once worn by Charles Manson, or pick a nickel off the ground and put it in your mouth? Or would you rather spend the night in a dingy bus station, or spend the night in a luxurious house where a family was once murdered? And as you kind of guess with these questions, what we're basically positing is, the difference between what is kind of a symbolic cost and a tangible cost. And well, one of the things that we think is that intuitionists are highly, highly sensitive to these symbolic costs, because if they rely on these heuristics a lot, all of these things that, stabbing a photograph of your family is just stabbing a piece of paper. But if you think that's your family, you're somehow or another hurting them, that's sensitivity to that kind of symbolic heuristic at work. And so we have a series of questions like that that are part of a kind of a larger scale. But I think those are in some ways the kind of the most emblematic of kind of what we're getting at here when we sort of measure intuitionism.
As far as the US, if you've done any research on this, do we know the percentage of intuitionists versus rationalists at this time in the US?
Well, most people are in the center, but the country kind of tilts more intuitionist than it does rationalist. So if you would say, I think we would, if we wanted to categorize this in some ways, it'd probably be more like, 30% of the country would be people who we would call strongly intuitionist, and maybe like 15% of the country who would be called strongly rationalist. And, most people are then kind of a mixture in between kind of those two poles.
My impression was from reading your work that it's easier to create the division between intuitionists and rationalists than it is to undo that. Is that the case?
Question is how can these two sides, bridge this gap? And I think the way it typically gets bridged is that you would have, within the political parties, you would have each side would have its intuitionists and its rationalists, and they would have to fight amongst each other to sort of set some common goals. But when you have this aligning along this kind of ideological dimension, it becomes increasingly difficult, because now not only are we disagreeing about fundamental politics, but we're disagreeing even more fundamentally about sort of how the world operates. About 25% of Americans believe that we're living in end times as foretold by biblical prophecy. And if someone believes that, you can imagine going through your day believing that, then everything must be a potential signal or sign. Is this the sign of the second coming? And you can imagine everything becomes ripe with metaphor and symbolism. And that's a very difficult thing if you are holding that belief. Imagine trying to reason through that, because that probably would supplant any other kind of concern that you might otherwise have. And that's just one example. I think a lot of people will just hold their beliefs because they're kind of core to their emotional architecture. They're a way of kind of giving them a stable ego and a way of understanding the world, and they cling to it very, very tightly, the way we do with all of our sort of, superstitions and habits of mind. But if that becomes the central operating, principle for your way of understanding the world, it's really, really difficult to sort of transcend that. And I early on when I was doing this, it struck me that one way that a rationalist might be able to, converse with an intuitionist is by empathizing with them. I know this is how it works for me with my kids. My kids are big intuitionists, so when I acknowledge their anxieties and acknowledge their fears, we typically can have a better conversation. I'm less optimistic that that's possible in the political sphere. And now I think, what's interesting when I actually have discussions with people, particularly people who believe in conspiracy theories, I've tried an alternative track, which is I basically asked them, I said, they come back to me oftentimes in a very hostile way because they see me as sort of attacking them. But I finally asked them, I say, okay, our beliefs are just our tools. They're things that we use to sort of navigate the world and negotiate the world. So I just asked them to reflect, what is your conspiracy theory actually doing for you? Is this actually helping you in any way? Do you think this is a useful way to go about living your life? And that oftentimes is not what people expect, and that kind of oftentimes opens up some opportunities for maybe a little bit of reconsideration there, and getting people to kind of just think about, okay, the utility of their own belief system, and maybe that's another way of kind of going forward. I think another way is trying to think about just, okay, what are the things that we have in common? What are common goals that we share, and trying to emphasize that. So.
Well, let me ask you this: is kind of the other side of that question. Is there something that rationalists do that tends to make the situation worse?
Um, there's a common trope that I know experience in my marriage a lot, which is that when my wife is complaining about like something not going right, and I say to her immediately, well, why don't you just do this? And then she throws something at me. She's like, you just don't understand. And I was like, oh, what she is looking for at that point is me to sort of say, yes, I understand, I hear you. And I think where rationalists sometimes get in trouble is by assuming that when they encounter somebody espousing something crazy, or what they seem to be crazy, or conspiracy theory or something like that, that they immediately try to reason with them away. And for the person who has that belief, that can seem really condescending. And it doesn't really coincide with what they're trying to do when they express their belief. So I think, a common mistake that we, I have this in spades. I mean, I work in a very rationalist enterprise. And so my worldview is very, very rationalist. And so I by default assume that that's how everybody else is thinking. And that's clearly not the case. And so instead of trying to immediately think, oh, my way of thinking the world is how everybody should be thinking, is realizing that's not how everybody should think. In fact, I'm kind of strange in that regard. And to go back and maybe first just listen to what people say and acknowledge what they are saying before immediately trying to refute their basic facts or kind of challenge them to a logical debate. I think that immediately puts everybody on the defensive, and then any kind of productive space withers.
So it's possible they'll actually get more dug in with that approach.
Yeah.
Okay, looks like we're out of time for today. We've been talking to Dr. Eric Oliver from the University of Chicago and author of Enchanted America: How Intuition and Reason Divide Our Politics. He's a researcher in the field of how conspiracy theories intensify political polarization. Dr. Oliver, thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Sure. Thank you. It was great to be here.